everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing great. Boy, this month we've had a little something for everybody in the weather department. We've had heat.
Yes.
4 days or so of mid-90s.
Yep.
And wind. Mm-hmm. And then we've had cold and rain, a little bit of snow in the area.
A lot of rain, yeah.
Tickling with frost. We didn't actually freeze, but it got so close it wasn't funny. And so, yeah.
Have you planted anything yet?
I did plant some lettuce before the rain started, when it was still kind of hot. I planted a row of lettuce, and I planted some potatoes.
Direct from seed with the lettuce, or did you
direct
have a
from
starter?
seed? Yeah, okay. Direct from seed. And I planted a row of potatoes. So I have not done our whole vegetable garden yet because I was concerned that we'd have some frost.
Yeah.
And I knew I couldn't protect everything, such as the tomatoes and other frost-sensitive things. So I delayed, and of course now we got generous rain, so things are a little wet. But I'm hoping now with sunshine and some average warmth, 70s sunshine, that I'll soon be able to get the vegetable garden totally planted and flower beds. But this weekend I'm going to do containers because regardless of the rain and everything, containers are, you can always seem to plant a container.
Yeah.
Even if I can't get out in the in-ground vegetable garden because it's got to dry, I can do the pots and planters. And so it's funny. I think this was probably some humor on Facebook maybe, but the reason we call it May is because it may be hot, it may be cold, it may be wet, it may be dry. And so we've had a little something for everyone.
Well, and you usually say, your kind of rule of thumb is the best gardening window is between, the 15th and 20th?
Yeah,
or 15th, I shouldn't say planting.
Yeah, 15th to the 25th is kind of year in, year out. It's that 10-day period that I just look at to get the planting done. Usually by then the weather has stabilized a bit. And so it seems like this year that's kind of a good period. I'll need to let some things dry a little bit. But the 15th to the 25th is just my year in, year out favorite planting time. At that time you can kind of assess, okay, what's the weather doing? Is it going to be too cold or whatever? And so that seems to hold true. I shouldn't call them old timers anymore. The well-experienced gardeners.
Right.
Used to say, nothing wrong with waiting till Memorial Day. And I think this year, Memorial Day is a little early, but this year, waiting till Memorial Day, I think had some truth to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, this is
There's
really
a lot of planting going to happen here last week or so in May.
Yeah, here we are when we're recording this. We're recording this on the Thursday before Memorial Day. So we'll probably, we'll see and hear a lot of people who are out in the gardens this weekend, weather permitting, and it looks like it should be pretty good.
Yeah, how are things doing in your yard?
Well, what we did so far is we put together some raised beds. And so we filled those with dirt last weekend because I was, when it was cold, you can still do that. That's fine. And we did plant a couple of tomatoes plants and a couple of other small herb and things like that plants. Nothing too big yet. And those seem to hold up to the wind and rain pretty good. But so, yeah, looking forward to really hitting it kind of hard this weekend, at least doing the planters, trying to get some other stuff in the ground, the things that we think need to get in. But yeah, it's coming together pretty nicely.
One thing that did enjoy this cool, chilly, wet weather are lawns.
Yeah.
Lawn grass, and I was lucky. I got some fertilizer down before the rain.
Oh, smart.
And so, but the grass is just growing like gangbusters.
Yeah, that was a smart move. I probably should have done that. Got out there before.
There's still time. But it's interesting. Those granules of fertilizer need water to dissolve and get down to the root system. And so Memorial Day is kind of a preferred time to get down fertilizer. So I was a little early, but I wanted to try to catch that rain. But there's still time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. The optimism of farmers or gardeners, this is going to be the best growing season we've ever had. The rains are going to come timely.
Yep.
The sun will be there. The temperature just
moderate,
right for growing.
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
And we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see.
Well, so
we'll do a recap at the end of the season.
Today we're going to talk about planting in the garden and especially also planning, how to figure out what to put where, how to kind of get the best use out of your garden, how to approach it smartly. Because anybody, I don't want to say anybody, but you could put a plant in the ground anywhere you want, whether that's the perfect spot for it, both whether it'll thrive there or whether it'll look the best. That's maybe another case. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. But you've got a question first. You had a question from a listener.
Mary wrote in and said, "Dear Don, I love your podcast. Usually listen when I can in the garden. You've taught me so much. Thank you to both you and John. I'm in Cass County, Minnesota, and my Honeycrisp was struggling." So she's got a Honeycrisp apple tree, was struggling a few years ago with what I think might have been codling moss. But we started spraying with Captain Jack. Captain Jack, the active ingredient, I believe, is spinosad, a good kind of organic type insect killer. Okay. And it got healthier. The apples are tasty with an occasional scab, but basically good fruit. This spring, I noticed a black fungus on the bark and some branches. This may be what you were just talking about on a recent podcast. It's flowering nicely, but I'm worried that the disease might spread to other trees. Is it too late to try a fungicide? Thank you so much, Mary. And she sent photos. And so the Honeycrisp apple tree on kind of the main trunk and some major branches have a very noticeable blackening of the bark, and you can kind of tell it's kind of internally into the wood for a certain depth too. So that black fungus is called black rot. And it is a major killer of apple trees in the upper Midwest. It drastically shortens the life of apple trees. It's responsible for the most part in why apple trees have a lifespan of about 25 years instead of longer. And so this black rot fungus invades in pruning wounds. It invades in, and of course, we need to prune our apple trees. Pruning wounds, but also sun squall damage during the winter. If we get sun damage on the bark, it can invade in that. So it doesn't take much of an opportunity, and this black rot fungus can invade. And once it gets a start, it then gets internal into the tree and eventually can and does kill trees. And so what do we do about that? So once you notice that black rot, that blackening on major branches, or maybe it's on the main trunk itself, once it has invaded like that, it's going to be difficult to get that to go away, because it's in there. Mary mentions a fungicide, and there's a relatively new fungicide called Infuse. Infuse, I-N-F-U-S-E, Infuse. Now, previously, fungicides were mostly something you applied onto the surface of either leaves or stems, and that would give a protective coating so that the little fungi and the spores could not get entrenched in leaves or foliage or branches or trunks. So it provided a protective coating, but the fungicide didn't really get taken internally. But this fungicide called Infuse is systemic, meaning that it's absorbed into the plant and it gives some internal protection. And so, for lack of anything better to try on an apple tree that is infected with this black rot, and the black rot is something when you see it, it's, oh yeah, black rot, doesn't it? You look at the picture, John, there, and yeah, it's kind of visible that it's the type of thing when you see it, you kind of know it. And so I would try Infuse. You can buy it online. I bought a bottle online. Some garden centers will have it. I checked some national chains. I could not find it there. So checked maybe locally owned for Infuse. And it gives you something to try. I don't know if, depending on how entrenched that black rot has gotten, I don't know how effective it will be. But this is a major problem. So I would try that. Will it spread to other trees? The fungi that causes this is all over the place. It's airborne, and so having the black rot on a tree doesn't necessarily mean you're going to spread it to another tree, because this fungus is already around. And so, so I think treating with fungicide is worth a try on that. And that's one reason for pruning apple trees. The old recommendation used to be, and I'm kind of going on about this because this is it's so vital and so common to people. But anyway, the old recommendation for pruning apple trees was during the dormant season. Newer recommendations from a good plant pathologist is to prune apple trees at the time that the leaves are starting to grow. That means the tree has woken up from winter, and it will start healing immediately, and less chance that fungus will be able to get into an open pruning wound. So again, thank you, Mary, very much. You bring up a question that's very common. Our apple trees are dear to us, and it would be nice if we could get them to live longer.
Yeah, and stay posted. We're going to have a whole show about apple tree care coming up this summer. We always do. So yeah, well, it's a great kind of reminder to stay on things. And also, again, something else to look forward to is all the great fruit that'll be coming up on the trees. Yes.
Well, thank you again, Mary. And well, John, let's get on to planting our gardens and vegetables and flowers.
Yeah. So let's just, it sounds pretty simple. You go out there, you put something in the ground, but it's not quite that simple.
No, I've made lots of mistakes. I've planted things without planning that I shouldn't have planted them where I did.
So what are the things that we should be considering? I think the first one that we all think of is is it going to get enough sun? Or is it going to get too much sun?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that crosses, regardless of what you are going to plant, whether it's vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, the exposure, how much sun, how much shade, crosses into all of those. And sometimes we don't always know a particular spot in our yard where you want to plant something. We don't always know how much sun it gets until you actually observe it. So to decide how much sun an area gets, you really have to view it, don't you? So now for most things, and of course the tag on many things, fruits, vegetables, perennials, annuals, will say full sun, part shade. And so full sun means a spot is getting all day sunshine fully.
Yep.
Okay. And then part sun, what's the difference between part sun, part shade? Well, they're kind of somewhat interchangeable. Part sun gets a little more sun than part shade, but okay. Part sun, part shade means half day probably of direct sunshine. Maybe it's like in the morning, gets morning sun, and then the sun goes and it's shaded the rest of the day. And if something indicates shade, that it requires shade, then that means most of the day, maybe it gets a little dappled sunshine, through a tree or something. But generally, that requires shade.
So what would half-day sun be? Because we're not talking 12 hours of sun. That's quite a bit, right?
Yes.
So what would half-day sun be?
Usually around 6 hours.
Okay.
4 to 6 hours probably.
Okay.
Yeah, if a tag on perennial says, part sun, I suppose it should get, 4 to 6 hours of sunlight.
And when
sunshine.
you were talking about maybe the morning sun, is there a difference between morning sun and late afternoon sun? Because late afternoon sun, we tend to think of as hotter. Does that have more of an impact on things? Or because it's what the plants want is they want the sunlight, they want the photosynthesis to take place. It's not so much the heat, but tomatoes love heat, right?
Yeah, exactly. But, that does make a big difference. So if we're talking half-day sun, that half-day really does depend on whether that half-day is in the morning or afternoon. Because you bring up a good point, John, that that afternoon sun, the day has heated up, in the middle of summer, the day has gotten hot. And so by the last half of the day, that sunshine is accompanied by hot temperatures. Whereas in the morning, that morning sun, as it's coming up, temperature is still kind of cool from the evening. So the morning sun tends to be quite cool. So I love the east exposures, that morning sunshine. For example, clematis does very well on a wall facing east. So it gets that half a day of sun. Roses also love that half day at least of sun, and then some shade in the afternoon. Like clematis and roses, they'll do fine with that half a day morning sun. And then if they're getting shade in the afternoon, the blossoms hold up better. There's less wilting and less intensity from that hot sun of the afternoon. So the morning sun, to me, is almost that ideal, the east side, east exposures is almost an ideal spot. And most perennials, including clematis, they need sunshine to really get good and vigorous and full bloom. But even that half day of sunshine on the east side really gives it that, I almost consider that full sun, even though it's kind of only half day. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, I love that east side especially. And so maybe if we get kind of into vegetables, when we talk vegetables, so if you're locating either a raised garden or an in-ground garden, most vegetable gardens would prefer to be in full all-day sun. A lot of the vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, love that heat. And melons, cucumbers, pumpkins, they all love that heat. So a full all-day sunshine, including the hot afternoon sun, they thrive in that. So that's the preferred. A spot that will not get afternoon or shade from the trees or whatever. So that's the preferred. And especially for anything that develops a fruit, like a tomato, a pepper, anything, a melon, cucumber, that has to provide, that has to develop that fruit, needs full all-day sunshine.
And by fruit, do you just mean any kind of produce?
Yeah.
Whether it's a berry
something
or a squash?
that originates from a flower.
Okay.
The old thing, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable? But botanically, anything that comes from a flower is a fruit.
Okay.
It's a ripened ovary. So anything that results from a flower, which includes the tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, pumpkins, anything that results from that really needs full all-day sun. That'll give you your best production. But what if you don't have full all-day sun? What if you're gardening on planters on a balcony on the north side?
Yeah.
Well, maybe there's some sunlight that comes in the morning a little bit, that angles, some in the afternoon, late in the afternoon. If a spot is getting maybe like half a day of sun, then anything that produces a root, such as radish, potatoes, carrots, that can produce okay without that full all-day sun that a flower-type fruit has to get. Okay, so radish, carrots, parsnips, they'll do pretty good even half day. But there's good news, even if you don't have much sun at all, anything that you eat the leaves of requires very little light.
So like lettuce.
Yeah, lettuce, spinach, most herbs, they'll produce decently.
Kale, if some people like to eat kale,
do you eat kale?
Not. I do not.
I'm not heavily into kale. But I should try it. I gotta say I haven't really tried it that much. The green color in a smoothie kind of turns me off. But if I need to close my eyes because I'm sure it's tasty. If any listeners
out there have good recipes for things to do with kale, I think I've found them best in soups where you really don't have to taste them. But I know some people really like them, so maybe we should have that. Maybe we should have a listener send in a recipe every once in a while. That'd be
awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, please do. And
so things that we eat the leaves of, they don't need as much.
Okay. Sunlight to produce a good leaf. And even cabbage can grow in somewhat shaded area because you're eating the leaves. You aren't expecting it to produce a blossom and go on to a fruit from that blossom. And there's other things we can do too in planning for vegetables. Of course, raised gardens. Oh man, awesome! Picking string beans from a raised garden, without having to bend over and stoop over. And of course, in raised gardens, planning is important so you can get as much out of that raised garden. So trellises to the back of the raised garden. Trellises will be a good option for growing peas.
Okay.
Pole beans can grow upward on a trellis. Cucumbers will grow on trellising. So a little bit of planning can help get more mileage out of a raised garden or a planter. also for small spaces, maybe it's pots on a patio.
Okay.
There are many container-friendly vegetables. And when you look at the seed pack or the tag, if you're buying started plants, many vegetables will say that they're container-friendly. That means they've developed to produce as much as possible in a small space. So that's always great. Well, and tomatoes. America's number one vegetable.
Yep.
Even on patios, we can grow tomatoes. Couple of things to look for. Again, the keyword container friendly. The size pot should be comparable to at least a 5-gallon bucket.
Okay.
You could use a 5-gallon bucket with holes drilled in the bottom, but it should be a decent size container. And so look for the words container friendly or determinate. Tomatoes fall into two categories. Indeterminate, and the tag will usually say the term. Indeterminate grows, I remember by thinking that they grow indiscriminately. They'll just keep vining and vining. And of course, that's hard to maintain in a container. So determinate tend to be more bush-like, a bush-like tomato that won't sprawl all over your balcony and then down beyond. So a determinate or container-friendly tomato will give good production in a container itself. So gosh, a lot of good vegetable gardening. Oh, another thing a person could consider too, whether it's in a raised garden or an in-ground vegetable garden, do you orient things east to west or north to south? I've gardened both ways, but the main thing is that what you plant doesn't shade other things.
Right.
For example, a person wouldn't plant tall sweet corn to the south of low-growing cucumbers, because otherwise they're going to get shaded,
right.
on the the shaded side. And so if you kind of locate the taller things so that the sun isn't going to shade the shorter things.
We've noticed that with doing tomatoes, where if we had the tomato plants right next to our pepper plants. Well, the tomato plants got so much bigger,
sure.
And it made sense to have them together, but they really were a different thing. So now we with our new raised beds, we're putting the tomatoes kind of in an area in the back, or so where what's next to them, to the north of them, won't get blocked out by that sun.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an important part of planning. Another interesting thing on garden planning is what about companion planting? Kind of the method in which possibly certain vegetables cooperate together to give better production, friendly towards each other, while other types of vegetables maybe fight each other. And I'm not talking about only space.
Right.
The companion type planting is the theory that certain things just give off kind of an aura that helps other types of things. And companion planting, when you do a little searching online, there's not a lot of scientific research that's been done on companion planting. That certain things, if you plant two types of vegetables close to each other, they won't do well, or other things will encourage both things to do better than if you didn't plant them side by side. Now, I've got to admit, in most of the gardens that I've done, I've just planted stuff. I've just planted one row next to each other, just kind of keeping the tall things up, where they aren't going to shade anything. But I haven't followed companion planting as such, making sure that the onions are beside a certain thing and avoiding others. And I've always had good production. There's not a whole lot of research been done on whether companion planting actually works. But I mean, just because there hasn't been research done doesn't mean that things aren't true. We haven't discovered everything that there is to discover. And so I never discount, if people have searched that certain things need to be planted by other certain things, I never discount that.
I know, like in American indigenous cultures, a lot of times they call it the Three Sisters, and they plant corn, beans, and squash together, that they all
definitely
grow well together, that they're kind of companion pieces.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example because the squash then can kind of run in between the corn stalks. The corn stalks rise up above. The beans, being a legume, do some nitrogen type fertilizer to the soil. So that's a good example of a companion planting that works well.
Yeah.
And so what I enjoy about companion planting, even though, you won't find hard research that it does work or doesn't work, I enjoy it. I enjoy the fact that we don't know everything yet. And it's fun to try things like that. So if it's working for gardeners, I say, stick with it.
We're going to try growing some potatoes in buckets, in 5-gallon buckets. So we'll see how that. I've got to drill some holes in some buckets this weekend and get those going. But that seems like that'll be kind of a fun project to try and see how that works out.
That'll be amazing. That'll be fun. Right. Harvest will be easy.
Yes, exactly. You know where they are.
You know where they are, and just kind of dumping the bucket out at the end of the season.
Much easier than having to
digging.
Pry open the ground.
Yes.
Well, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, let's talk about pots and planters for annual flowers.
Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
All right, we're back, and this week we're talking about how to plan a garden, how to plan what you put where. We talked about how to approach your vegetable garden. Let's talk about pots and planters for annual flowers. How do you know if you've got a big planter? How do you know what to mix together? How do you know where to space them? How far apart? What are the things that people should consider when they're doing pots and planters?
Well, and planning is so important. When a person's got a pot of a certain size diameter, the planning. Okay, how many plants do I put into that pot?
Yeah,
and that's where the planning comes so important. Experience is a great teacher for that, because if you've combined certain things, you know that they mix well together. So one of the biggest challenges when knowing, how many plants are you supposed to put in a certain size container? I've looked to see is there some sort of a standardized formula, like if I have a 14-inch diameter pot, I need 4 plants or something. I cannot find that rule of thumb. And then it occurred to me, well, here's why. Too many of the plants that we put in our containers, flowering plants, they're too different.
Okay.
For example, an annual grass that you might put, to put up in the middle, that's going to rise up above. Okay, that's going to take a fair amount of space. So if you put one of those in too small of a plant, it's going to occupy quite a bit of space. But also, if you plant, certain things just don't take up as much space. Another good example is sweet potato vine, the ornamental sweet potato vine. That gets quite aggressive and takes up quite a bit of space. Lobelia, the little blue-flowered plant that also does some trailing, that's quite petite. That's not going to take up as much space. So what I'm getting at is, for a certain size container, depending on what you put in there will dictate how many plants you need. So if I was going to do a 14-inch diameter container, and if I'm going to put in a sweet potato vine, I maybe only have room for 2 other things in that. But if I'm not going to put in the sweet potato vine, that's going to hog a lot of space, but I'm going to include a lobelia and maybe an impatiens and maybe something else, maybe I need more plants. So what I'm getting at is it depends on what type of plant as to how much space they're going to take in that plant. Yep. So, and that's where a little bit of experience is sometimes necessary. We kind of learn after a growing season of living with sweet potato vine, you soon learn, that's going to take quite a bit of space in that container.
Yep.
So we soon learn with experience how many plants a container needs. One interesting thing when developing a flowering container, kind of a neat little phrase that was developed a few years ago, when you're trying to put together a pot or planter and what's going to make it look nice, the phrase, a thriller, a spiller, and a filler. Well, it works well.
It does.
So a thriller is going to be something that when you look at that container, it's eye-catching. Maybe it's a big flower, a colorful flower, something that when you look at, that's what you see.
Might be something that's a little bit taller.
Yeah, exactly.
Stands out, literally.
Yep, very much. And then the spiller is a kind of a vining type thing that's going to cascade over the edge. So it'll kind of conceal the edge of the container and it'll kind of give beauty over the edge of that and kind of extends the whole flower part down over the edge. So the spiller would traditionally be something vining, like snowstorm. Have you ever grown snowstorm?
No, never done snowstorm.
It's a kind of a vining trailing with white flowers.
Okay.
A snowstorm. Another name for that is bacopa. Snowstorm makes a very good spiller, spills over the side. The sweet potato vine that I mentioned, that will spill over nicely. Lobelia, the vining type,
like a lobelia,
will trail over the side. And the filler then is kind of the plant that will transition between the thriller and the spillers, just fill in the gaps. And so you can't go wrong by including a thriller, a spiller, and a filler in your planter. I think that was kind of a neat way of combining that. And so a person also needs to consider the height of the plants. So that if it's a smaller height container, you don't want something too tall that's going to look like it's going to tip out of that size container. Oh, the other thing that's so important in planning flowering containers is that when you're all done planting it, if it looks immediately beautiful and full, we've done it wrong, haven't we?
You've put too much in.
Oh, yeah, we've put too much in. Of course, that's the temptation to make it look immediately beautiful. But those plants then don't have any space to grow. Now, it's interesting when you put annual flowers in a container, if you were to put those annual flowers in an in-ground flower bed, the oftentimes spacing on the tag is 9 to 12 inches. For example, if I'm going to put a geranium in a flower bed, the tag would say space 9 to 12 inches apart. So then we put them in a combination flower planter. We don't give them that much space, but that just indicates that they would like some space to grow. So it's okay if after we're done with that flowering container, if it looks like there's some gaps, because it'll quickly fill in, and then each of those will round themselves out to their full potential instead of quickly not having enough elbow room and then starting to go downhill from there.
Yeah, I know that I've planted a couple of super tunias in a hanging basket when I really only needed one. And you really saw it that they were just kind of competing for the space and they didn't look comfortable. So yeah, it's much better sometimes to just less will be more.
Yes, you got it. Because the downside of having it look beautiful immediately is pretty soon they're going to start going downhill.
Yeah, they may not age well throughout the summer.
Precisely.
How about in flower beds?
Yeah, so in in-ground flower beds, we don't need to follow a neat order. We don't have to have the row of tallest things in the back and the short things in the front and the medium things in the middle, unless you're doing a kind of a very traditional look. What's the word I'm searching for? Not traditional, but kind of the opposite of free form.
Oh, like formal?
A formal. Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, if you're doing a formal flower bed where you want everything just precise, maybe edged with the same type of thing, and then a flower type in the middle and taller in the back, formal. That's what I was trying to think of. The opposite of that is kind of the cottage garden look. A little more whimsical, where you kind of mix things in. And so sometimes it's interesting in an in-ground flower bed to bring some of the taller things a little bit forward. not hiding short things behind them, but just mix it up a little, give a little bit of tension to that flower bed, a little bit of interest to that by bringing some of your taller things in our own flower beds. I like a marigold called Big Duck Yellow, which gets 18 to 24 inches. And so I will sometimes bring that up towards the front in some spaces, bring that up towards the front, put something a little taller in the back, but it just mixes it up a little, unless you're designing for Buckingham Palace and maybe you need everything very formal and rigid. And so, gosh, this is making me exciting. Yes. I want to get our planting done.
Yeah. And I like that idea too. Like what are some other ways to get different heights? If you wanted to try some things, you could put something like the, what do they call it, the shepherd's hook, some hanging plants in there. That's a good way to get some different height too. Yeah. Yes.
In an in-ground flower bed, it's kind of fun, to give it a little bit of dynamic energy. Hang basket on one of the shepherd's grid, or incorporating a container into the middle of an in-ground flower bed, container or two, that gives it some height, and so that everything isn't just all on one solid plane, but giving it a little three-dimensional look too. I like that idea.
Yeah, that's always kind of fun, just to kind of have your eye kind of roam around a little bit versus looking down on the ground and across the ground. You want some things to really kind of pop out. That's always kind of fun.
It's interesting too, John. Some of these concepts, as I'm thinking of these, sometimes we know and we can get the concept in our head, but sometimes when you're actually looking at how do I incorporate this, how do I implement this, it's not always so easy, is it?
No.
And of course, with perennial beds, that is oftentimes a challenge for me. In my head, I kind of know what I'd like it to look like. Or maybe you've seen garden magazines. Well, wow, that is the perennial garden I want. And then when you try to actually figure out how do I do that, what do I plant in the ground? What do I plant right here and there? That's what I struggle with. Trying to figure out how do you plan a perennial flower garden. Now your yard and your perennial gardens look very nice. So you've obviously put some good thought into that.
Yeah, we tried to approach it like that. Yeah, just kind of give it the idea of giving it some depth and giving it some different areas, some different focal points, and mixing things up in there. And, that's one thing that we've started doing too, is that in areas where we've planted something that is in its first year. And we'll get to this when we talk about perennials, I guess. But, when you plant something in your first year, it's not going to grow right away. You don't expect that big thing. But so we sometimes will supplement that in a way by putting in some annuals, potted annuals, maybe in a planter or in something else that's kind of decorative that fits in that area, and to give it a little different height, or to put it in a space that will eventually be overcome by with what you did.
Yeah, because that's a great use of annual flowers, is to give you some good instant color for this season.
Yep.
Things are going to do well. Maybe it's your shrub landscape around your home. Maybe it's a new perennial garden. Things are going to take a little time to develop, but those annual flowers just bridge that gap. Let's get right into the perennial flowers that you mentioned, because your yard is nice. You mentioned in perennials a keyword there, a focal point. Now, in planning a perennial garden, focal point, of course, is something that's blooming beautifully during a certain time. And in perennial gardens, one of the planning aspects that is so important is to incorporate types that bloom early in the season, some mid-season, and some late in the season, so that there's always something blooming. I got a kick out of old Professor Neil Holland. He said, oftentimes people will wonder, they're looking for a perennial that will start blooming in spring and bloom all summer long, all season long, and into the fall would be nice too. And so he said, well, that one has not been created yet. And so, but that's okay, because even though each perennial type kind of has its season, that's okay, because the perennial garden is always changing. The way it looks in June is not the way it looks in August.
Right.
And so there are very few perennials that really bloom from May on through September, October. There are a few that have a little wider a blooming period. Some have a little less, but generally we need to make sure we've got something spring flowering, summer flowering, late season flowering. And that's why I love going through the perennial garden almost every day, because it's changing all the time.
It is.
And so purposefully planning something like that during each of the seasons is so very, very important. And, of course, even on a small scale, a person can still have, you can start out with tulips and peonies and iris for early in the season.
Bleeding heart for shade.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful.
Our bleeding hearts came in strong and fast this year. Once the weather got right, and now they're blooming. It's great. It's great to have them there.
Ours didn't come back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ours, yeah. Thanks for your condolences. Ours, I don't know if the rabbits got them and just chewed them off to a point where they didn't come back. They were relatively new, a couple of years,
yep.
And so they were not well established, and they did not come back. So could be a combination of tough winter, but I think the rabbits probably kept gnawing them off as soon as they came. So anyway, I'll be looking for a division at some point, John. And of course, the other thing too, very important for planning, we talked about sun, part shade, perennials. Perennials love to be in their preferred sun shade type thing. Bleeding heart. The more shade that gets, the longer the foliage will stay nice into summer. If it's in full sun, a bleeding heart in full sun. My parents had a beautiful bleeding heart in full sun. But it would go dormant about the 4th of July.
Okay.
About July 4th, the leaves would turn brown and kind of die off and then be bare. But we'd plant other things around it. But the more shade it gets, that foliage will remain longer into the season. So does yours stay?
Yep,
the foliage stays
kind
decent?
of right up against or close to a fence. So yeah, it does. It gets a fair amount of shade. But in the fall or towards the end of the growing season, it is one of the first things to die back.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so finding out what your exposure is, and then locating the perennials, sunshade, locating them, that always works well. The other thing that is kind of neat, if depending on the size of your perennial garden, if you have enough space, for example, when iris are blooming, rather than having iris just in one spot, if you can have iris kind of in several or 3 spots within that perennial garden, so that then when it's iris blooming time, you've got them kind of intermingled in the whole garden there. Another thing that works well too is rather than one iris plant in one spot, you get a little more impact if maybe you've planted 3 in that spot. So when that blue iris is blooming, you've got a little larger clump right away.
This is something that some gardeners will talk about. Do you go by odd numbers when you're doing groups? I know a lot of,
yes.
I hear
3,
that a
5,
lot.
or 7.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
That's the way you go.
Yep.
You're an odd man?
nature, and that was a design principle in landscaping or other planting, is in nature, things are rarely in even numbers. They tend to be a little more natural free form if they aren't in a square block of 4. And 2 looks kind of, paired up somehow, but a triangle of 3 seems to look a little more natural. And so I do, 3, 5, 7, if you're higher multiples than that, somebody probably isn't going to count whether you've got 12 or 13, but especially the lower numbers, you can kind of distinguish between even and odd, and the odd always look a little more natural. So I do. That's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, I like the idea of grouping things, especially things that won't be, grouping groups of flowers together is nice. And then to kind of spread that out, and, some people, gardeners, landscapers will talk about the idea of repetition, or,
yes.
bringing things back. So even if one's if you have, like our lot is only 50 feet wide. So if you have something on one side and then over on the other side, it does kind of tie it together, as they
It
say.
does. The other fascinating part, too, about perennial gardens is all the different types of shapes and blooms. For example, combining the different textures. Maybe it's broadleaf perennials beside those that have kind of a narrower leaf. That's why I like iris, because their sword-shaped leaves kind of just blend well with the broader leaves of, maybe it's a peony or something like that, a perennial that has broader leaves. Also, the different shapes of flowers. The round flower shape of daisies mesh well with these spike-shaped flowers of things like the perennial salvia. So just the dynamic of the different shapes of flowers, and that's why, including different types of things, I think is so important. And not only are they vary in bloom time, but also just the difference in textures and spike-shaped versus rounded flowers. And we don't need to be too overly hung up by putting all the low-growing things in the front and then a row of medium-growing things and the taller things in the back.
These are not class pictures that we're taking where
right,
people are...
Yes, exactly, where you line them up by height.
This is not your football team or your basketball team we're taking pictures of, yes.
You got it. And so, mixing the heights up a little bit, bringing some of the taller things forward a little bit and then planting an even taller thing behind that, just makes them look very, very natural and a little less rigid. So, gosh, it is fun. The perennial flower garden is just, again, I'm always trying to place things in this mental picture that I have. Sometimes I achieve it, sometimes I don't. That's why I end up having to move things sometimes.
Yeah.
And
don't
that's
be afraid
okay
to move
too.
things. Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite things is ornamental grasses. I really like. Those are things that are taller, but they really kind of have a nice. They
do.
A lot of times they will last longer into the fall. They add a nice kind of a fall and even winter appeal. But you've talked about before that kind of sense of movement.
Yeah, I love the movement. The swaying in the breeze. That gives when you're looking in the perennial garden. That movement that they give. I love that too.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about planting shrubs. Okay, so 10:43. So this can just be kind of a sort of thing.
That sounds perfect.
Do you just want to do you want to do fruit trees too, or should we just end with shrubs?
Let's end with shrubs,
and then we can do a show, like I said, a show on trees coming up.
Let's end with shrubs and foundation plantings.
All right, we're back. We're talking about how to plan out your garden as we're ready to get in there and dig up some dirt, put our plants in the ground, but to what goes where. And let's talk about shrubs, because, while we just talked about that it's okay to move things like shrubs, you kind of want to get them in the right spot to begin with.
The first time, yeah, exactly. Because, we can't really be moving our shrubs around the way we do perennials if we get them in the wrong spot. So, planning is very important. And so uppermost maybe in planning when you do shrubs around your house foundation or whatever is to check the tag. And I'm saying this to remind myself, check the tag for the height and the width, especially the width of the shrubs, because I've located things too closely to each other. Also, if you're locating shrubs around the house foundation, and I've made this mistake, not coming out far enough. I've never heard anybody 25 years after they planted their foundation planting, I've never heard anybody say, man, we came out way too far. It's always 25 years later, I wished I would have come out farther from the house, because now I stayed too close to the house with my planting and it looks like they're all crowded near the foundation. And so come out farther than what you think when you're planning that whole area. The other thing too, we don't need to circle the house foundation with plants. It's nice to have some things kind of around the corners, to kind of bring the house out into the yard and into the landscape. But the purpose of a foundation planting of shrubs isn't to hide the foundation. It's to make the house look like it's more part of nature. And so part of that means you bring the plants out a ways. So again, coming out from the house a ways. Ours is a 2-story house. So I came out about 12 to 14 feet on the corners. I could have come out a little farther, I think. But again, so when you're looking at individual shrubs, how far apart to space them, look at the tag. I look at the width. I focus on the width that shrub is going to be. And then when figuring out how to space all these different shrubs, I give it that footprint of its width. So if a dogwood says it's going to spread or it's going to have a width of 4 feet, then I give it that 4-foot circle, that footprint, and then whatever shrub I'm planting next to it, I give it that footprint so that they'll touch, if I want them to kind of touch and close the area, but not to be impeding each other,
right?
Which is so common because they all look so tiny when they're small.
Yeah, they can touch, but you don't want them pushing at each other.
Exactly.
It's like kids in the back seat. You don't want to crowd them in.
Yeah, exactly. And so, sometimes you'll see on a tag, it'll list spacing. Okay, it'll list the height, the width, and the spacing. The spacing is okay if you're going to plant 20 of the same thing in a hedge then. But what if I want a dogwood beside a little Princess Spirea? Then the little Princess Spirea probably says space 2 feet. Well, I can't space that 2 feet from the center of the dogwood because the dogwood's going to be overtopping in no time, if you follow me.
Yep.
So again, don't always look at the spacing, but look at how wide that shrub is going to be and then give it that footprint of space, I think is a better way. And overcompensate, give things more space. If come out farther from the foundation. And over time, I think you're going to be grateful that you did. And so give things plenty of space. And
pay attention to what you're putting by. You don't want to have something that's going to grow right over the faucet. You want to make sure that you have access to things, vents, windows. You don't want to block out anything there when you're planning to put these things there. You keep in mind height too, that you don't want something that might grow up and start blocking out a window.
Well, you must have visited our home because the Trader mulberry that I planted.
I'm my own home. We've done this too.
The Trader mulberry, I kind of neglected to investigate. And so I planted it within 5 feet of the house. It can develop a spread probably of 12 feet, and it gets 30 feet high. And it's so anyway, I goofed. Trader mulberry would have been better in another spot. Now I have to prune it annually, but that'll keep me occupied. So I'm including myself in all this, that study the height on some of these things as well, so that we get the right plant in the right place. Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun.
It is. And planning is ever so important, isn't it?
And it really does I know that getting out there and planting can be kind of a chore, but it's also nice. It's nice to take a step back and to look at things. And even though they're not at their mature stage when you plant them, they're not ready, fully showy yet, but you know that will come. And it's a really good feeling.
It is. It's great. And so, we are right on the threshold of planting and right in the planting season and the upcoming growing season. And I'm excited. It's going to be fascinating to see what this season holds. I hope it'll be a great one for all of us.
All right. Well, if people have questions about planting or anything else related to their garden and yard, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, keep the cards and letters coming. My email, donald.kinsler, Kinzler, donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu.
And also include photos are always great.
Photos are always great.
Questions.
For example, Mary's photo of the black rot fungus, as soon as I saw that picture, that defined what the problem was she was struggling with.
And you don't always have to send photos of problems. Send photos of your successes. We'd love to see how your planting's going. We'd love to see how things are looking in your yard.
Yes, I wrote the garden column about garden tools, and we've discussed garden tools in podcasts, and it was fun. A number of people sent me letters of their favorite tools. So the exchange with fellow gardeners is awesome.
All right, Don. Well, you have a good planting weekend.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening.